Okay, so thanks for joining us to the second edition of the Australasian Microeconomic Theory Workshop. It's a pleasure to have Ömer Karaduman, who is graduating from the MIT and joining Stanford GSV in July. He's going to present a paper, his job market paper on the economics of grid-scale energy storage. Ömer, take it away. You have until 1:15. And we'll ask questions during the talk. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. And Alex, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be virtually here. This was my job market paper, Economics of Grid-Scale Energy Storage. I'm going to join Stanford GSV as a postdoc next year. This paper is mostly empirically motivated, so I will have a model of electricity market, but the main technical contribution of the paper is going to be the algorithm to find an equilibrium when we are introducing a new player, new technology such as grid-scale energy storage. And I use South Australian electricity market data to understand energy storage's impact on electricity market. So to motivate energy storage, we need to take a couple of steps back. So decarbonization is key for fighting with climate change, and electricity production is a key part of it. So in US, it accounts for 1/4, and in Australia, it accounts for 1/3 of overall CO2 emissions. But not just because of that, it's also the production of electricity is also important for future transition to a clearer economy when we're electrifying other sectors such as transportation and heating. The way that we're trying to make production of electricity more clean and more green is via renewables. And renewables are great, in general, they're green, but they come with a caveat. So they're intermittent and non-dispatchable, meaning that their production depends on some exogenous resources, such as wind and sun. And that exogenous resource varies with some other exogenous factors that we can't really control. So that creates a change in production of these technologies, and we can't really control that production. So normally, for other types of goods, this is not much of a big problem. You can pile it up and use it later on. But electricity is a different good. It's highly non-renewable, so that you need to balance demand and supply very closely at all times. So this change in renewable production in the short run causes imbalance. In the absence of energy storage, we usually use high carbon emitter technologies that runs on oil and gas to maintain this balance. I mean, as I said, the electricity is highly non-renewable, so that also is going to create a change in cost of electricity production or marginal cost of electricity production in time, which in turn is going to create a change in price of electricity in time. So we have a change in electricity in time in many markets all around the world, which is going to create an environment for energy storage to engage in arbitrage. So energy storage, when I say energy storage, you can think about large-scale batteries, lithium-ion batteries that can meet demand of more than 50,000 people's electricity demand for more than 2 hours. So these are very big batteries. We don't have many at the moment, but we have several, and we're planning to have more in many parts of the world. So this technology is basically a capture of energy produced at one time that the users use at a later time. And in this project, in this paper, I'm going to focus on energy storage's arbitrage opportunity, meaning that energy storage is going to buy electricity when the price is low and sell when the price is high. So it's going to engage in price arbitrage in time. And given that, the opportunity cost of production of electricity for energy storage is basically going to be the price of electricity at the time of charging. So if there's a variance in prices in time, as I said, because of the non-durability of electricity there is, energy storage is going to make revenue by engaging in arbitrage. But while doing that, it will also change social returns. It will have a price impact. So there's going to be a pecuniary externality. There's going to be transfer between consumer and producer surplus because of this price impact. There's also going to be change in market power of incumbent firms, if there is any. But on top of all of these, there's going to be also real impact of energy storage. So there's going to be change in efficiency of production. So what I mean by that is, when energy storage buys, there's going to be new units that needs to produce that extra amount of electricity. And when energy storage sells, it's going to replace some units. And if there is a difference between this marginal units efficiency in terms of cost of electricity production, energy storage can change overall electricity cost of electricity production in the overall system. Similarly, can change CO2 emissions as well if these marginal units have different CO2 emission rates. But on top of all of these, if we have lots of renewables, as I said, you need to match demand and supply at all times. If we have a case where we have lots of renewables so that at some time periods, supply of renewables exceed demand, in that case, if you don't have enough technology, then you need to curtail, you need to waste some of these renewables. And energy storage can help with that by basically buying that waste, that renewable production that would have been wasted otherwise, and inject back into the market when the prices are high. And these changes are particularly significant when energy storage is large. So price effect of energy storage is obviously going to be very large. But on top of that, also the efficiency of production is going to be very large, because the cost of electricity production, the overall cost of electricity production in electricity markets is usually convex. So when demand is higher, the cost of electricity, the cost of production is going to be much more higher. So my research question is, are incentives for investing and operating in energy storage in the wholesale electricity market socially efficient or not? So related questions with that is, like, whether investing on energy storage is socially efficient or not. So there could be some arbitrage opportunity for energy storage, but these technologies are still very expensive. So there's a big fixed cost part. Is it worth to invest in energy storage? That will very much depend on energy storage's impact and its cost. And do prices create socially efficient incentives to operate? Energy storage is different, as I said, different than the incumbent firms, different than thermal generators, in the sense that it looks at price differences in time rather than price levels. So maybe prices in the current setting, in the current electricity market, might not be right incentive for energy storage to operate. In terms of CO2 emissions, energy storage's impact is not clear. It depends on the market setting. It depends on the particular market and particular structure that you are working on. So it's not that clear whether it's increasing or decreasing CO2 emissions. And supporting renewables, energy storage is usually thought as it will support renewables because it will decrease the waste, and it might help renewables to get more revenue. So is that a reality? That's also another question related with that. And at the end, there's also this political debate about who should own an energy storage. So I will talk about how different local governments and how different local governments in the US thinking about this very differently. So as I said, there is a big, we don't have many batteries and energy storage at the size that I'm talking about. And the biggest reason for that is the cost. Even though the cost decreased around 70% in the last decade, and we are expecting it to decrease even more, the costs are still very high. And batteries, but on the other hand, it's very advantageous to deal with this intermittency that I talk about, that caused by renewable availability, because it provides very fast adjustments. And on top of all of this, it doesn't really require it doesn't require a lot of transmission grid expansion, because these batteries are very compact. You can put that in a part of the grid easily, much easier than other storage technologies, such as pump hydro or similar technologies. So there are lots of incentive programs in California, in Australia, in South Korea. There are many other countries that also have incentive programs. But all of these programs, they they come with the different ownership discussions as well. So FERC, which is the federal entity that governs wholesale electricity market in the US, they released an order in 2016. They mandate all the electricity market in the US to come up with a set of rules for energy storage to participate in the wholesale electricity market. And different parts of the US took that, used that very differently. So California has a mandate for utilities to own an energy storage. But on the flip side, ERCOT, which is the entity in Texas, they have a ruling that they do not allow utilities to own an energy storage. So I will talk about why these policies might be different, given different type of challenges and different type of policy ideas that these local government might have in mind. So today, as I said, I will build a dynamic equilibrium framework to quantify energy storage impact in the wholesale electricity market. As I said, we don't have many energy storages like the size that I'm talking about. Therefore, the energy storage that I am going to model here is going to be a hypothetical energy storage. I will allow for its uncertainty. Energy storage is going to be uncertain about prices, and implicitly related with prices is going to be uncertain about how other firms are interacting, how other firms are bidding, and how the demand is evolving in time. And I will allow incumbent firms, mostly thermal generators, to best respond to energy storage entry. And at the end, I'm going to calculate a new equilibrium and new equilibrium prices to endogenize energy storage's price impact in the electricity market. So there are two main technical challenges that comes with that. One is energy storage's problem is inherently dynamic. So one dynamic aspect is, as I said, the price that is affecting how energy storage is thinking about the future. If the prices are higher in the future, I might wait today or I might buy today to sell tomorrow. But on top of that, there's also going to be a capacity issue. So these energy storages are big, so they can buy for a long time, for like 2 hours, 3 hours, and sell in 3 hours. That means if you want to sell in the future, we might want to buy now, but if you're full, you can't really buy. Or if you're empty, you can't sell. So the capacity of usage of energy storage is going to be the strategic variable that energy storage is picking. So the action of energy storage is basically going to be which capacity do I want to be at this time period. But this is not the main technical challenge. In electricity markets, empirically, firms submit their willingness to produce as supply functions. And that creates a problem because empirically, finding supply function equilibrium is very difficult. Sometimes it's not unique, sometimes it doesn't exist, and usually non-tractable empirically. So to get around with that, I compute a supply function equilibrium by using estimated best response to observed variation in demand volatility. So what I mean by that is when energy storage buys low and sells high, it's going to smooth prices. It's going to increase prices when it's buying, and it's going to decrease prices when it's selling. And by smoothing prices, it's also going to smooth demand. So if I see in the data that changes the variation, changes the demand volatility, similar to that might be caused by either renewable availability or change in demand. If I see some demand, change in demand volatility in data like that, I can use firms' responses, firms' strategies in that case as a best response to energy storage under some assumptions. And by iterating this process, I can compute a supply function equilibrium. This is not a unique one. This might not exist. I don't have a proof for uniqueness or existence, but empirically, I always find a supply function equilibrium by using this sort of a contraction mapping. But I do not prove that this is a contraction mapping. I will talk a little bit more about that in the model section. So let me preview results very fast. So ignoring price effects, obviously going to overestimate storage's profit. So what I mean by that is when energy storage is buying, it will increase prices. When it's selling, it will decrease prices. So if you ignore energy storage's price impact, you are going to overestimate energy storage profit. But I find that at the size that I'm modeling, ignoring price effects overestimates energy storage's profit by 50%. So that's a substantial amount. So that says that if energy storage is relatively big, then these price effects are going to be very important. I also find that there is an underinvestment problem, meaning that energy storage is not going to be privately profitable. So the cost of energy storage, the fixed cost of the installment cost of energy storage is going to be higher than its arbitrage opportunity. But the price impact of energy storage is going to increase consumer welfare, and that increase in consumer welfare is going to be larger than the installment cost, which makes energy storage consumer socially desirable from the perspective of consumer. I also find that social returns are different under different ownership. So if you let utilities, anyone on the demand side, have an energy storage, they will operate energy storage differently than the independent energy storage or energy storage that is owned by renewable, and they will have different social returns. For the CO2 emissions part, I find that energy storage decreases CO2 emissions, but not by a lot. It decreases very little. So for any given reasonable amount of carbon tax, these results are not going to change. For the renewable part, I find that in the case of no curtailment, meaning that we are not wasting any renewables, which is the case in many countries and many regions now, energy storage is going to hurt renewables revenue. So this is purely the price impact of energy storage. But in the case of curtailment, energy storage is going to increase renewables revenue by decreasing curtailment. So energy storage is going to buy that the amount of renewable production that would have been wasted otherwise. So renewables revenue is going to increase mostly because of that. I will talk more detailed about these results in the results section. In the interest of time, I will just mention about related literature. So there is a big literature in electricity markets about market power of thermal generators and renewables impact on electricity markets. There is relatively small literature on energy storage and environmental impact of energy storage or the value of energy storage in economics. There's a sizable literature in system engineering and EEE, but most of them are either assuming no price change or exogenous price change, which would have been a valid assumption if the energy storage is small. But here in this paper, I'm assuming that energy storage is going to be big enough to support renewables to change electricity prices. So at this point, if there are any questions, I would love to answer them, maybe a couple of them.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? It appears that you consider only chemical storage as an alternative. Hydro storage is not an option, right?
So in my model, I'm implicitly assuming that the energy storage engage in arbitrage in short time periods, like within day, between days. So for hydro, if that's the case, you can use this canonical model for hydro as well. But for hydro and pump hydro, they usually, sometimes they use seasonal changing in demand, maybe like in week changes in weekly demand, etc. But this paper is focusing on short-run arbitrage. Okay, if there are no other questions, I will go to the next part. So I will talk about, I will just illustrate the basic economics behind energy storage impact. I will briefly talk about data, then I will talk about my model and the algorithm that I am proposing to find the new supply function equilibrium when we introduce an energy storage. And I will briefly talk about the empirical methods, and I will finish with my results. So in order to illustrate the economic forces behind energy storage, I will illustrate a perfectly competitive electricity market for 2 periods. So we are going to have classical thermal generators, renewables, and energy storage. And storage is going to buy and sell Q units of electricity. So this Q is an arbitrary Q. Energy storage is not going to maximize its revenue in this example. I'm just basically going to compare profit of energy storage and other social returns, such as consumer surplus, welfare, and renewables revenue. So here we have on the y-axis, we have price. On the x-axis, we have quantity. There's going to be a variable renewable energy available at cost 0, and it's going to be available at the same level for both periods. And there's going to be on top of that PCQ, which is a convex aggregated marginal cost curve. This is, since this is a perfectly competitive market, this is going to be the same as aggregated supply function in this market. So we have 2 different periods and 2 different demands. I'm assuming that demand is perfectly inelastic, and it's lower in period 1 than in period 2, which creates the price differences between period 1 and period 2, which is going to give an opportunity for energy storage to buy in period 1 and sell in period 2. So when energy storage is buying in period 1, it's going to shift demand to the right. And when it's selling in period 2, it's going to shift supply to the right in second period. But since demand is inelastic, it will have the same impact as if shifting demand to the left in the second period. So this is implicitly giving a priority to energy storage to meet the demand, and which is the case in many countries. So new prices are set. One thing to notice here is the price impact of energy storage in the first period is lower than the price impact of energy storage in the second period, and it's purely because of this convexity. So the profit of energy storage is going to be basically changed in this new price levels, price differences times the quantity, okay? But while doing this buying and selling, energy storage is also going to affect other market outcomes, such as total welfare, consumer welfare, and revenue of renewables. So total welfare is, change in total welfare is basically the change in cost of electricity production in both periods. So in the first period, energy storage is going to increase cost of electricity production, but in the second period, it decreases the production of cost of electricity production. So since this aggregated cost curve is convex, the total welfare change is going to be larger than the profit. Okay, and this is purely about the cost structure in the market. But changing consumer welfare and changing revenue of renewables is purely about the price impact of energy storage. So when energy storage buys in the first period, it's going to increase prices. So consumers are going to pay more in the first period. And the second period, price is going to increase. Sorry, second period price is going to decrease, and it will decrease even more than the increase in the first period. And since consumers are consuming more in the second period, there will be a larger impact for consumer welfare. So consumer welfare is going to increase in result. But revenue of renewables are going to decrease. It's purely, since I'm assuming that renewable production is fixed here, it's purely going to be about the average price impact. So energy storage will decrease average prices here because its price impact in the second period is larger than the price impact in the first period. So therefore, renewables are going to lose revenue. So if Q is small, basically you can shrink this Q in both periods. Then the change in W, change in total welfare, is going to be almost the same as the change in profit. And change in consumer welfare and change in the revenue of renewables are going to be almost 0 because renewable storage's price impact is going to be very small. But in electricity markets, we usually have market power, so that the aggregated supply curve is usually not the same as aggregated cost curve. So here I'm basically assuming that there's a market power, and this market power increases as the Q increases. So the aggregated supply curve is getting steeper as Q increases. So this leads a larger price variation. So energy storage is going to make more money, and energy storage's price impact is going to be larger. Therefore, consumer welfare impact of energy storage and change in revenue of renewables is going to be even larger. But notice that the change in cost of electricity, which is a change in total welfare, is going to be the same. So here, even Q is small, we might have a case where change in total welfare is bigger than change in total welfare is smaller than the profit of energy storage. But as I said, this is for an arbitrary Q. How about in real life what energy storage does? This is an actual energy storage production and actual prices. So on the left-hand side, we have a stable price day where the price is on the red line, and the blue line represents the production of energy storage. So when energy storage is production below zero, that means energy storage is buying. When it's above zero, that means energy storage is selling. So on the right-hand side, we have a volatile price day. So as you can see, in the stable price day, energy storage doesn't engage in arbitrage, or it doesn't engage much in arbitrage. But on the right-hand side, in the volatile price day, it follows prices very closely. So we need to think about the model of energy storage's strategies, not just as a very simple sort of a buy at the beginning of the day or sell at the midday. We need to we need to model energy storage production or strategies specifically for each type of different days. So at this point, let me stop and let you ask a couple of questions. I can't really see the chat. So if someone wants to, if Juan Carlos can ask me the questions on the chat.
So there is a question in the chat, but it has been partially answered. So I'll make it here. And so the question is, the model seems to only deal with the market for energy. In South Australia, batteries have made a lot of money in the market for ancillary services. Something chemical can do, hydro not so much. Is your model undervaluing the battery?
So that's a great question. So today many of these energy storages are used in this frequency response market and ancillary services. But in the future, so these markets are very small compared to the energy market. And in the future, I believe most of the revenue, the lion's share of the revenue of energy storage is going to come from energy market. So here I'm basically neglecting that part, but I'm well aware of that part is the main sort of revenue for energy storages right now. I mean, in South Australia, for instance, introduction of Hornsdale energy storage cut down cost of ancillary services by 50%. So if you introduce a couple of more players into this market, the revenue of energy storage in that market might shrink very fast because that market is relatively small compared to the energy market. So in the future, probably most of the revenue is going to come from energy market. So that's why I'm focusing on energy, only energy market in this paper. I also see another question about the loss rate, the round trip efficiency of energy storage. So so in the toy example, I assume no round trip efficiency. So in practice, when energy storage is buying and selling electricity, it loses some of it in the process. So for lithium-ion batteries, for instance, it loses 15% of the energy that is buying. At the end, you lose a 15%. So in the results section, I use 15%, but in my model section, I also do not talk about this value loss, but you can basically introduce that very easily. If there are no other questions, I will go to the model part.
So there's another question which is, so let me read it. The design of the battery is driven by the potential revenues on offer, e.g. FCAS drives faster responses, but shorter duration batteries. Arbitrage drivers, longer duration. And the question is potential revenues an endogenous or exogenous variable with respect to storage specification or design?
So here the revenue of energy storage is going to very much depend on the size of the energy storage, and it's going to be very much depend on the efficiency of energy storage. So that's going to be, the design is going to be very important. But the one that I'm modeling here, the results are about, I'm just modeling one particular size of energy storage, which is the same as Hornsdale energy storage. So I'm basically modeling Hornsdale energy storage, which is the one that we have in South Australia, its impact, its potential impact. But I have other, for other type of technologies, other type of size of energy storage, I have results as well, but most of them are following the same logic. Okay, so let me go to the data part very quickly. So I'm using South Australia electricity market data. This is a part of NIM, which is Australia's national electricity market. I'm using data from July 2016 to December 2017. So in this market, firms are using step functions for each of the 48 half hour of the following day. So in order to submit their willingness to produce, firms submit 48 different supply functions for the following days to meet demand. South Australia is a very nice market for this type of applications. One reason is wind generators almost make up 40% of the generation in South Australia, which is one of the highest in the world. And this also leads to very high price volatility. I mean, not just this, because there's we don't have coal power plants in South Australia. That also leads to high price volatility, which creates a nice environment for energy storage to engage in arbitrage. So there are 3 big firms in South Australia that makes up almost 95% of the combustion generation, which raises a question of market power in this market. And at last, the largest lithium-ion battery in the world in 2018 came online in South Australia. And the reason why I'm not using that data is because in that time period, in 2018 to 2019, there's been lots of entries of renewables. And this lithium-ion battery, which is a Hornsdale battery that has been installed by Tesla, they have an agreement with the local government about its participation in frequency response market. So I didn't really want to deal with that part because that involves sort of a dual optimization in 2 markets. But I compare my results with the actual revenue of this energy storage, and in ballpark they are very similar. So I use data on forecast and realized demand and prices. I use unit level half-hourly bids of firms for each of these half-hour periods. I use forecast and realized renewable generation, and I use industry estimate costs and emissions for each of the power plants to compare the overall change in electricity production cost. So now I'm going to go into the model. I will first talk about electricity market and market clearing condition, and I will introduce the information structure about firms, so how they think about electricity demand here. And I will talk about their payoff and their strategy. Then I will define an equilibrium, and I will show why this equilibrium is very hard to find. Then I will introduce an algorithm to potentially find an equilibrium. Okay. So there is a day-ahead multi-unit uniform price auction in electricity market. This is very similar in many parts of the world. So for each age periods of the following day, there's going to be an auction. So each periods, I'm assuming that demand, DDH, is perfectly inelastic. At the beginning of every day, there's going to be a public signal XD, which is a member of calligraphic X as a signal space. And this public signal is going to give an information about the distribution of demand vector for tomorrow. So this vector is basically has a 48. So this is a vector of 48. So this signal XT is going to give firms an information about how demand is distributed tomorrow for each of these half-hour parts. And the signal follows a Markov process. So each firm K, they bid a supply curve XKDT. So this supply curve is basically, it's not just actually a single supply curve, but it's 48 different supply curves. So each firm is going to bid for each of their units 48 different supply curves. So the strategy space is immense in this market. And market clearing price is going to be basically where demand meets supply. So there are three types of firms: storage, thermal, and renewables. And from the get-go, I'm going to make the assumption of renewable generators production is going to be non-strategic and exogenous. So given that, and we know that many system operators around the world is going to give priority, is giving priority to renewables to meet the demand first. I'm going to be interested in what I call net demand, which is basically going to be the difference between demand and renewables. So what this implicitly says that firms are going to compute the meet demand after renewables met with demand. So whatever left after renewables, that is the part that is going to be relevant for players in this game. So storage is going to solve an infinite horizon problem, which is linked between days and periods through charge level, CH, given its power and energy capacities. So the CH is basically how much electricity, how much energy do I want in my battery to be ready to sell in this period or to buy in this period. But one assumption here that energy storage picks set of charge levels for the whole day at the beginning of the day. So I'm assuming that energy storage is not updating within the day. So I have results in which I allow for energy storage to peak charge levels within the day as well. So that increases the computational intensity, but it doesn't really change results much. It's increasing storage's revenue a little bit, but not much. So energy storage is going to pick its charge level for the whole day, but also thinking about tomorrow as well, because how much energy do I end this day with is going to be important for the profitability of the next day. So for instance, if I'm expecting high prices at the beginning of tomorrow, I might want to end up with a large amount of energy in my storage to be ready to sell at the beginning of the day. But in converse, if I'm expecting very low prices, I might want to sell everything today, and tomorrow I might want to buy a little more because prices are going to be very low tomorrow at the beginning of tomorrow. So basically energy storage is going to maximize its net present value. The flow payoff is going to be about how much energy storage produces times expected prices. And there's going to be a continuation value that is about the signal for tomorrow and my charge level today. So my assumption here is storage's charge level at the beginning of the day is a private information. So I can relax this assumption. That doesn't hurt things much. That is going to give me the same results in ballpark, but it increases the state space immensely. So it increases the computational burden a lot, but at the end, it doesn't change results much. So I'm assuming that it's a private information. So what that implicitly means is thermal generators are going to be myopic. So thermal generators are going to think about at the beginning of the day, it's just going to think about what is the signal at the beginning of the day. So it's not going to think about history of signals up to that point. So they receive an independent private signal, epsilon JD. So that's the private signal, which might be about their cost or their profitability or their future contract for today. So it's going to receive that. It's going to receive the public signal XD, and they're going to maximize their expected daily profit. So this is implicitly assuming that there is no cost complementarity between periods for thermal generators. So this is probably another good assumption for nuclear power plants, which might, like nuclear power plants, they can't really change their production very fast. So it's very costly to change their production, which is, it's called the ramp up and ramp down costs. But in the context of South Australia, we have lots of gas power plants, which has a relatively low cost of adjusting their production. And here I'm also assuming that within day adjustments are in here. The only thing that I'm assuming that between days, thermal generators are not thinking about much of their ramp up and ramp down costs. So they're basically solving their expected daily profit problem, given other firms, be it other firms' strategies. So here, the equilibrium is not an actual markup perfect equilibrium, but it's a one version of that. So thermal generators are going to maximize their daily profit. Storage is going to maximize its net present value of revenue, and market is going to clear where demand is equal to supply plus energy storage production plus renewable production. So second part is relatively easy, given like energy storage's problem is a dynamic problem, but it's relatively easy if we have thermal generator strategies. The problematic one is the first one. So the supply this is a supply function equilibrium problem. So it's computationally intractable. It's not unique. So this is going to be the challenging part. And in the next part, I'm going to introduce an algorithm that can help us define a supply function equilibrium by using data by using market data without energy storage to compute market prices with energy storage. So if there are any questions, I can have questions at this moment. If there are no questions, I can go to the next part. Okay, so in this part, I'm going to introduce an algorithm that can help us to find energy storage impact. So the roadmap for that is basically I will start by using data, market data, without energy storage to find an equilibrium with energy storage. So as a first step, I will assume that thermal generators are going to, they're not going to best respond to energy storage. So given this public signal, thermal generators will have their strategies. So energy storage is going to face with basically sets of residual demands and expected demand given this public signal. And I will solve this problem and I will come up with a policy function for energy storage that will depend on the charge level and the public signal. I will update market clearing condition after energy storage's production. So I will give a priority to energy storage's production just like I gave it to renewables. And now other firms are going to compete to meet this new demand after energy storage's production. Then I will construct a new signal about this updated demand, which will give an information about distribution of this updated demand, just like the one that I introduced at the beginning about the public signal about the demand. Then thermal generators are going to update their strategy under this new signal. This new signal is going to come from the same set as the old signal. So in a sense, I will preserve supply function equilibriums conditional on these public signals. Okay, so in a sense, we have, let's say, a rainy day and a sunny day. So what energy storage does, it will basically increase the sunny days in the sense that it will have a more like smooth demand in some measure. So thermal generators are going to have more sunny days instead of windy days. Okay, and then I iterate this number from number 1 to 4 to find an equilibrium. So to illustrate this idea, I will give you a picture about this new signal. So let's say we are facing this net demand, and distribution of this net demand is conditional on seeing signal xk. Okay, on the x-axis we have day of the hour, on the y-axis we have the net demand. So when energy storage produces, we find energy storage production policy function sigma I. it will smooth net demand since it's smoothing prices. Okay, so this will have a distribution. So if we find some distributions for this set of signals that we had, set of conditional distributions that we had in the data, if we have a similar distribution for a different signal, let's say XM, that is very similar to the one that we are seeing after storage production, the idea is basically, using firm strategies in the case of XM as a best response to energy storage. Okay, then on top of this, energy storage is going to produce again. Then we will go back again and forward and again. Then we will iterate this process until we find fixed point. Okay, so this XM doesn't have to be just one day. It could be a complex combination of different distributions. So the success of this process is very much dependent on the data variety and the changing net demand distribution. So the more differences in net demand distribution that you have in data, there will be more opportunities to come up with such distributions to match this new net demand after energy storage production. So as I said, I update the market clearing condition, meaning that I give priority to energy storage. So now thermal generators are going to compute to meet this updated demand, D prime H. And I'm going to construct a new signal, X sigma I, that depends on energy storage production sigma I, observed only by thermal generators from the same set as X. And my assumption is for any X, I can come up with this conditional distribution of this updated demand that is almost same as one of the distributions, almost same as the distribution that we had in the data. So this is to say that if my data is rich enough, I can degroup, like after energy storage production, I can degroup the net demand distribution, the updated demand distributions in a way that is similar to the distributions that we already have in the data. So this is sort of is going to if you have different classes of demand distribution, which is like one is more smooth, the other is more volatile. So you will start to see more smooth days instead of volatile days. So it's going to change the occurrence of these public signals in some sense. So given this new signal, X sigma I, other firms are going to change their strategy, so their problem is going to change. But we have this updated demand distribution. We have a similar updated demand distribution in the data by assumption, which is X is, if X equals to X sigma I, then that will give the same distribution as the demand that we had earlier. And my proposition is, if the signals are the same, then following the same equilibrium strategies in the market without energy storage for these thermal generators are going to represent an equilibrium in a market that energy storage follows a strategy of sigma I. So this is this is an assumption of like, this is an equilibrium. There could be more equilibriums. Firms might act differently, but under these assumptions, this is going to be an equilibrium. So the main technical assumption then, and probably the most controversial assumption here is, I'm assuming that storage best response conditional on signal X, whereas thermal generators, they best response conditional on X sigma I star. So the information structure of these two type of players is going to be different. So without this, everything gets really messy, and the number of equilibriums are really multiplied, and the sort of this algorithm is really hard to follow. And this assumption, I relax this assumption in different parts. So I allow for the energy storage's charge level to be visible. So sort of I try to converge the information structure for both of these players into a similar set. That, as I said, increases the computational burden a lot, but doesn't change results much. But as I said, this is sort of maybe the assumption that might be a little controversial. But this is an equilibrium, and I introduce an algorithm. So this process that I talked about earlier, so I repeat this process until I find an equilibrium at the end. So if there are any questions, I can take questions.
Can I ask a question before we jump into the empirics? So you using data from South Australia?
Yes.
But in Australia, there's no day-ahead market. So presumably the strategies are going to be quite different. Does it matter much for your results?
So it's a good point. So day-ahead market, it's not going to. So in one case, I allow for firms to change their. So in one of the robustness checks, I allow for energy storage to change its production. It's basically makes it like continuous market for energy storage. But firms, I see that, so there is no day-ahead market, but there is a I forget how it's called, but there is a market where you need to actually submit your bids day ahead, similar to the day-ahead market, but you don't have to commit. In data, I see that there is not much variance in between. So when people bid in the market a day ahead, for these thermal generators, they update their production, they update their bids within the day, but their real production doesn't change much. So I'm also assuming that, so basically firms are not changing their production within the day. If I allow for that, that's also could make it very intractable. Yep, that's basically an assumption that I have.
Thank you.
Any other questions about the algorithm and the model?
Yeah, I was just trying to clarify. Implicitly, you're assuming that the thermals anticipate that their action has a strategic response by storage, but storage doesn't.
Storage does, but that's sort of, yeah, storage does in the sense that after storage produces, firms update their strategies, and storage knows they update their strategies, so storage resolves its problem again.
Yeah, but it doesn't anticipate that its decision affects thermal.
Yes, that's so. In some sense, because of this information structure, there are different signals. So energy storage is not anticipating its effect on a signal, but after the signal is introduced, its best responses to firms' best response to energy storage. But in a sense, yes, they're not anticipating the change for the incumbent firms as the best response to energy storage. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to go into the empirical model methods rather fast because I think I'm running out of time. So I'm using data to estimate basically this partitioning, this calligraphic X, this signal space. And given that signal space, I also introduced a simple model to estimate the distribution of net demand. And given that, basically, I calculate firm strategies, then I solve for energy storage problem, then I solve for this fixed point problem. So the way that I'm calculating the signals, I'm clustering forecast net demand data into groups. So I have 16 different groups in which I use K-median clustering algorithm to group these forecast net demand. So in a sense, at the beginning of the day, what you see is one of these 16 signals that will give you an information about what will be the distribution of net demand tomorrow. And that net demand within the day follows an era one process. So there's a persistence, meaning that last half hour's demand is going to be important, what will be about the demand of this period. And there's going to be fixed effects. And there's going to be a shock to this demand as well. So there's an assumption here that the shock to net demand and shock to firms' profits are independent conditional on the signal XD. So conditional, like anything that is related with this signal XD is going to be in the demand and in the supply bits, and the shocks are independent conditional on XD. So I'm basically estimating the Markov process given this signal and the occurrence of this signal in the data. I can calculate the Markov process, and then I empirically estimate the distribution of bits of firms conditional on XD. So interestingly, this signal X, which is coming from the clustering of forecast demands, it explains 85% variation in demand, in realized demand, and maybe more interestingly, 90% of the variation in bids. So this is actually something that firms seems to be really taking into account. So but the reason for like why the demand is 85 explained by 85, because this is probably it's about like whether the system operator in Australia is doing a good job or not. So they're missing the variation by 15%. I have lots of empirical strategies. You can I will give this to Juan Carlos and Alex, this presentation. So if you're interested in the procedure, you can look at that. But if there's no other questions, I will go into the results. If you have questions about these empirical strategies, I can spend another minute or so. Okay, let me go to results.
Sorry, there is actually a question in the chat. Might want to have a look.
I can't really see. Let me. Okay. So I can. Okay, so in NEM you can rebid right up to clear yes. Yeah, I mean it's. So rebidding can change results, but I'm not expecting that to change results much because even though I'm assuming there's no ramp up cost between days, within day, since I'm using empirical bids, within day firms are going to think about their ramp up and ramp down costs. So given those ramp up, ramp down costs, and given the technological restrictions, I'm not sure whether firms will be very flexible to change their productions, but that definitely can underestimate or overestimate the impact of energy storage. It can go either way, but I don't have a result about that. That's a good point. So let me go to results. So as I said, the results can change with the different type of technology and different type of ownership of energy storage. So I'm modeling a hypothetical monopoly energy storage, which is a single entity that is independent energy storage with 120 megawatt hour and 30 megawatt capacities with 85 round trip efficiency, which accounts for 2 to 10% of net demand in South Australia. So this is exactly the same as the Hornsdale energy storage that South Australia has at the moment. So to disentangle energy storage's impact, I compared 3 different cases. So first I assume no price effect, similar to the literature. Then I assume energy storage's price effect, but no firm's best response. And then at the end, I calculate the new equilibrium prices, and I also let firms best response and find new equilibrium prices. So to illustrate how these are changing the prices, in this graph, blue line is basically storage's energy level in one representative day. So this is from our data. So black line is the price path in a case where there is no price effect of energy storage. Red line is the case where firms are not responding, and the green line is the price path where everyone is responding in equilibrium prices. So you can see that storage smooths price path. It decreases prices when it's selling and increases prices when it's buying. And introducing firm's best response, it smooths further, but the impact is not that high. So the first order impact is about energy storage's production. So firm's best response is not going to affect too much. So here I have yearly returns for 1 megawatt hour of energy storage production under alternative modeling assumptions. So in the first column, we have a case where energy storage do not change prices. So in that case, there won't be any change in consumer welfare because there's no price effect. So in that case, so this is the cost of energy production, is basically the installment cost of energy production divided by 20 years. So that's one of the assumptions that I have. So in that case, I find that profit of energy storage, like energy storage make profit. But when you introduce a price uncertainty, when you introduce an uncertainty for energy storage in expected prices, that profit drops a lot. So that means that when energy storage faces with uncertainty, it almost makes no money. And on top of that, if you introduce energy storage's price impact as well, it loses further. And if you, on top of that, allows for firm's best response, it decreases energy storage profit even further. But one thing to notice here, when you introduce a price impact, energy storage is going to affect consumer welfare, consumer surplus as well. So consumer surplus increase that is induced by energy storage, in the case of no firm response or firm response, is very close to the cost of electricity production, and in the last case is actually larger than the cost of energy storage, which makes energy storage privately not profitable but socially desirable from the perspective of consumer. So I find that this price impact is a significant point. So it has a significant effect on profitability, and the literature, which assumes no price effect, might overestimate energy storage profit a lot.
Omer,
So
there is a question,
sure.
Before you move along, there is a question in the chat asking you if you consider seasonality, short and long, in the model, because it has a direct effect on renewable energy generations and also for price of electricity.
So I'm abstracting from seasonality by this Markov assumption. So for energy storage, I don't think that will change things much, because the energy storage that I'm modeling here is using short-run fluctuations, short-run price fluctuations. So even in the seasonality case, energy storage is going to look for high price and low price periods within the day or between 2 days. So it's probably not going to change things much. It may change the profitability of incumbent firms, but I'm not expecting that to change things too much. So if there are no other questions, I will go in the next set of results, which is about the ownership. As I said at the beginning, I first consider a monopoly as standalone energy storage, but you can also consider an energy storage that is owned by consumer side, or energy storage, the perfectly competitive energy storage market, where energy storage doesn't have any market power. So monopoly energy storage, independent energy storage, is going to account for its price impact in the market. Therefore, it has an incentive to underproduce. So in a perfectly competitive energy storage market, you can think this as a mini small energy storages that coordinate, that produce at the same time. So similar to like if every household has a similar technology, a small battery that could simulate the same impact as if a perfectly competitive storage market. So in that case, this is basically the energy of energy storage, the capacity of energy storage under different ownership structures for a representative day. So blue line is similar as we had in the last graph. It's a monopoly energy storage. The red line is load on energy storage. So this is an energy storage that trying to minimize, try to maximize consumer welfare rather than trying to maximize its own profit. And the perfectly competitive one is the one that is trying to maximize its profit, but doesn't think about its price impact in the wholesale electricity market. So you can see that monopoly energy storage underproduces relative to competitive energy storage. That's the difference between green and blue line. And load energy storage is producing much more in different periods. So this is like, it produces less at the beginning of the day and produces more in the later of the day. That's because load on energy storage searches for higher price impact. So at the beginning, we saw that energy storage's price impact is the key factor for consumer welfare. So load on energy storage is going to look for periods, not high price periods in particular, but price periods where residual demand is really elastic. In other words, the price impact of energy storage is really high. So it could be a period where the price is low or price is high, it depends. So load on energy storage is going to have a completely different incentives than the monopoly energy storage. So here I'm comparing three different ownership structure of energy storage and their profit and their consumer surplus in the market. So for a monopoly energy storage, so this is a yearly returns. So for monopoly energy storage, similar to the first set of results, you can see that the energy storage is losing money, but its effect on consumer surplus is higher than its cost. So which makes energy storage socially desirable from the perspective of consumer, but privately not profitable. But also the other part is the change in overall cost of electricity production. So this is the change in overall cost of electricity production. So energy storage decreases cost of electricity production, but not close. The change in cost of electricity production is not even close to its cost, its installment cost, which says that in terms of total welfare change, energy storage actually decreases total welfare. Okay. So for load on energy storage, it's losing more money, but in return, it increases consumer surplus more because it's designed to increase consumer surplus. But you can see that the change in consumer surplus is compared to the monopoly case is really high. So there's a 50% change in consumer welfare. So if you're particularly interested in consumer welfare, and if you're thinking there are market power issues in this market, you might want to incentivize utilities to own an energy storage. So that's the case for utility-owned energy storage. So in a competitive market, where energy storage doesn't have any market power, there is going to be a profit loss because they're not accounting for their price impact, so they don't have underproduction incentive. In return, they're going to change consumer surplus a little bit more, but as you can see, the market power of energy storage is not a big concern here because the competitive case and monopoly case, they're not that much different. So this result says that there's an underinvestment problem and potential underutilization problem if you're thinking about the consumer side. So there are two main distortions that causes this. One is market power of monopoly storage, which, as I said, it's not much of a big deal, but also a market power of incumbent firms. So the reason why load-on case and monopoly case is so different, it's mostly because of the market power of other firms. If everyone was bidding the same thing at all periods, we would have the same result in the monopoly and load-on case. I mean, there's going to be a market power as well, but we would have the same result as load-on and competitive case. But since there's a market power of incumbent firms, we have this discrepancy between load-on and competitive one. So before going into the next set of results, let me, if you have any questions. So I see a question in chat.
Yes, so let me read it for you.
Sure.
Do your results suggest consumers should subsidize all batteries because they smooth prices to their benefit, or just that they would benefit the most from owning them?
I mean, this result says that either way, they will be better off. Because it's like even like for monopoly case, for instance, even if consumers subsidize an independent owner, they're going to make money out of this because consumer welfare is going to increase. But so here the consumer is sort of like in electricity market, consumer is not households, they're mostly utilities and some big like big industries or like big buyers of electricity. So from thinking about households perspective, it's a little bit difficult to think about. But in terms of utilities, you can think that utilities would want to invest in energy storage, and they actually want to, like in many parts of the world, utilities are the first ones who are thinking about investing in energy storage, not just because of this impact. This is not the force that they had in mind. The main motivation for them is mostly rooftop solars and like local grid problems and utilities transmission problems. But yes, I find that overall, one consumer, if you're thinking about one consumer, they will be willing to subsidize. So let me just briefly mention, as I said, I found that the energy storage is decreasing CO2 emissions. So there are two main drivers for CO2 impact of energy storage. One is round trip efficiency. So energy storage is losing some of the energy while it's charging and discharging. So that is increasing the production of electricity in overall power systems, because if you don't change the demand, if you're wasting electricity, that will increase the production. So that force is going to increase CO2 emissions, but it's also changing the marginal units. Therefore, the other driver is CO2 emission differences between these marginal units. So in monopoly case, I find that energy storage decreases CO2 emissions, but in low down case, it increases because it produces a lot. And so here, there are no carbon tax, and firms are low down competitive one. They're not thinking about their carbon emissions. But if you also put that in the problem, I'm not expecting that to change too much, because this is like in 1,000 tons. So if you put like $20, $50, and $100 per ton, that will mean this would mean to increase in cost for like 100,000. That's not too much of a big deal. Let me just briefly talk about renewables and energy storage. So as I said at the beginning, so energy storage is going to affect renewables profitability as well. So in the first case, the baseline case, energy storage hurts wind revenue and solar PV's revenue. If you double the wind, energy storage actually increases wind's revenue, and it increases consumer plus much more than the baseline case. But for solar, we don't see such a difference, because solar PV. So is about two main consideration. One is energy storage is changing average prices. So this is going to hurt both wind and solar because their production is exogenous. But there's also going to be other factor that's important is going to be the correlation of renewable production and prices. And solar PV, since their solar PV's production is highly correlated with prices, and for wind the correlation is lower. So energy storage is going to hurt solar PV more because it's going to decrease prices when the price is high and increase prices when the price is low. So that will hurt solar more. So overall, I in this paper, I introduce a model to quantify a hypothetical energy storage impact on the wholesale electricity market by endogenizing a price impact by finding an equilibrium. Also, I find two main market failures, underinvestment and underutilization. These can be solved by sort of policy that we already have in hand. Capacity markets might be one way to solve energy storage's underinvestment problem. And for underutilization, there's an ownership discussion, because if you're not thinking about, if you're not worried about the consumer welfare, if you're worried about the total welfare, you might not want to subsidize energy storage. And I find that energy storage does not really support renewables when there's no waste. So this is in South Australia. It maybe might be different in different markets, but I find these results especially interesting because when we think about energy storage, we think these technologies go hand in hand. And then overall, I think we are probably going to need a new market design, because when we have 100%, if we have 100% renewables, the market price is going to be like, what's the market mechanism to find prices? So that's probably the biggest question that we need to face in energy markets. Thank you very much.
So let me take one more question, if there's any, because we ran out of time. So if there's no question, let's thank Ömer for this great talk and for agreeing staying late at night in the East Coast of the US. Thanks very much, Ömer. It has been a pleasure to meet you and to hear from your work.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
So I hope to see you next week with another seminar. All the best.